Far from the noise of civilization, on the border of Montana and Canada, where the forest grew denser and the roads disappeared under the snow, stood Jack Connor's cabin. Simple, wooden, sheltered from the winds by ancient fir trees, it had been his home for the past 5 years. Here, time flowed differently, slowly, like the frozen river outside his window. For Jack, this silence was a salvation from his past life. But today, as the sky was covered with heavy gray clouds, the silence seemed frighteningly deep. Through the frosted glass, Jack watched the forest turning into a white desert. The temperature had already dropped to -20, and each snowflake falling from the sky seemed like an icy spike driven into the ground. On the table in front of him lay an old radio, crackling with a weak signal. The announcer's voice, distorted by static, sounded like a warning from a distant world. The temperature will drop below -40. The storm will peak at midnight. Avoid any travel. Jack turned off the radio and reached for his mug of cold coffee. At 38, he had seen enough winters to understand that this would not be just a cold night. This was a night when survival became a matter of tactics, habit, and a bit of luck. He put on his old leather boots, pulled on his thick jacket, and stepped onto the porch. The icy air instantly gripped his face like a predator. The sky above was pale gray, like steel. Jack carefully inspected his wood supply, checked the fastenings on the doors and windows. In his world, every detail could be crucial. The weather was merciless, but he understood its signs better than human language. The faint cracking of branches warned of the weight of the snow. The wilting silence of the forest meant that even the birds had left this place. However, something was unusual today. For a moment, Jack froze, hearing a distant crack. Ice underfoot? A broken branch? He couldn't be sure, but the sound was different from the usual noise of the forest. He slowly looked around, but in the veil of falling snow, nothing was visible. Back inside, Jack closed the door and bolted it. His thoughts returned to that crack. The forest always warned of changes, but it never did so for no reason. Later that evening, as the sun disappeared, giving way to icy darkness, Jack prepared for the night. He added logs to the fireplace, checked the generator, and poured himself some soup from a can. The wind outside was intensifying, turning into a relentless howl. But even this howl could not drown out the anxiety that began to creep into his consciousness. When the clock on the wall struck 10, Jack heard it again, a muffled, barely discernible sound from outside the wall. He stood up, listening, feeling the hairs on his neck stand on end. A deep, guttural sound, too low for the wind, too familiar for the silence. He approached the window, took a flashlight, and directed its beam into the night. The white curtain of snow hid everything, but at the edge of his vision, where the light from the house lamp mixed with the darkness of the forest, something moved. At first he thought it was just a snowslide or a falling branch, but the figure was too large. It moved slowly, making its way through the snowdrifts. Jack squinted, trying to make out the details. Soon the figure came close enough to become clearer. It was a bear, and behind her, clinging to her legs, were two cubs. Jack stepped back from the window, feeling his heart rate increase. Bears in winter? Unbelievable. They should be hibernating. But here in the wilderness, explanations didn't matter. What mattered was that this family was clearly not coping with the cold. He looked out the window again. The bear was moving slowly, her massive body barely holding up under its own weight. The cubs, very small, staggered, clinging to her paws. The cold had already begun to take its toll. Something was wrong, very wrong. Jack took a deep breath, trying not to panic. He whispered to himself like a mantra. This is not my concern. This is nature. Nature knows what to do. But a few minutes later, he was back at the window. The family of bears was now very close. They had stopped at his porch, huddled together, as if understanding that they could go no further. The bear's eyes met Jack's. In her gaze, there was no aggression, no threat, only fatigue. Heavy, overwhelming fatigue. Jack felt his hand instinctively reaching for the door lock. The storm outside intensified, but at that moment, the howling of the wind was drowned out by the sound of his own thoughts. What should I do? The cold burned his fingers as he stood at the door, his hand frozen on the lock. A little more, and he could have turned the handle. Open the door. But that would violate everything he believed in, all the rules he had learned in his life in the wilderness. He stepped back, then another step. The door remained closed, but the bear's eyes continued to look at him through the window. They were not empty or wild as he expected. There was something human in them, as if she was begging him, not for mercy, for time. Jack shook his head, trying to shake off that thought. It's just an animal, he muttered, heading toward the fireplace. You can't do anything. He picked up his mug, but the coffee was icy, as were his hands. They trembled, although it was warm in the cabin. Outside, the wind's howl intensified, as if performing a mad symphony of winter chaos. Gusts of snow lashed against the windows, making it seem like the cabin was being torn down. But Jack knew this was only the beginning. By morning, the storm would be deadly. He tried to distract himself. He sat at the table, laid out cards he used for planning routes when he went into the forest. But the lines of roads and trails blurred before his eyes. All he could think about were the bear and her cubs, huddled under his porch. The clock struck midnight. Jack couldn't take it anymore. He approached the window again, pulled back the curtains, and looked at those who were trapped on his doorstep. The bear lay in the snow, her massive body shielding the cubs from the wind. She breathed heavily, steam escaping from her nose in rare clouds. One of the cubs pressed against her side, barely moving. The other lay slightly to the side, its body almost motionless. They're dying, Jack thought. The cold inside him seemed stronger than the one raging outside. He wanted to turn away, close the curtains, forget about it, but he couldn't. You knew what you were getting into when you moved here, he reminded himself. You're alone, and they're alone. But that doesn't mean you have to interfere. And yet, the bear's eyes, they wouldn't leave him alone. At 2 a.m, Jack made a decision. It was madness, he knew. But something inside him had already broken. He could live with loneliness, with cold, even with fear, but not with just standing by and watching them die. He put on his jacket and winter boots. He pulled on his hat and gloves, then grabbed several heavy blankets and a couple of cans of hot water he kept in case the pipes froze. They have a chance, even if it's small, he thought, opening the storage room door. It was a small room with thick walls that he used to store tools and supplies. It was insulated, and he could keep it warm without turning on the main heater. The plan was simple: lure the bears into the storage room, where they could survive the storm. Jack understood how dangerous this was. Even an exhausted bear could attack at any moment if it sensed a threat to its cubs. Opening the porch door, Jack froze. The wind hit him like an icy wall. The bear raised her head, her eyes gleaming in the flashlight's light. She let out a deep moan, which sounded more like a moan of fatigue than a threat. It's okay, he whispered, not knowing why he was even speaking. I won't harm you. He threw one of the blankets onto the snow a few feet from the bears. The bear jerked but made no attempt to attack. Then he stepped back, giving her space. Jack saw her nostrils flare. She clearly sensed the warmth coming from the cans and blankets. However, she didn't move. Her strength was waning. Then he took a step forward. Slowly, holding the can of hot water in front of him, he approached closer. His heart was pounding so loudly that he could barely hear the wind's howl. The bear watched his every move but didn't move. When he was close enough, he carefully placed the can on the snow. Its warmth began to rise in thin streams of steam. Please, he whispered. His voice was drowned out by the roar of the wind. But it seemed the bear understood. She rose to her paws, swaying, and slowly approached the can. Her enormous, ice-covered paws barely left tracks on the packed snow. Jack held his breath as she sniffed the can, then turned her head to her cubs. One of them tried to stand but fell back. The other remained motionless. This was the moment of truth. The bear looked at him. Her eyes said more than words ever could. Then, carefully picking up one of the cubs with her teeth, she took a step toward the storage room door. Jack didn't move, didn't breathe. He only prayed that this would be enough. When she entered the storage room with the first cub, he felt his tense body relax slightly. This was only the first step. But the night was far from over. The storage room, a small space attached to Jack's cabin, filled with warmth as soon as he closed the door behind the bear. Inside it was dark, only a narrow beam of light from the small window dividing the storage room and the main part of the house. Jack stood in front of the window, watching what was happening inside. The bear carefully laid the first cub on the wooden floor. Her massive body trembled with exertion, but she turned back to the second cub, still lying in the snow. Jack could see how her paws barely supported her as she stepped back into the night. She didn't complain. She didn't even make a sound. She just breathed heavily as she leaned down to the motionless cub. At that moment, Jack realized she was so exhausted that every step of hers was an act of survival. He couldn't just stand by any longer. His heart screamed louder than his mind. "All right," he whispered, though the wind howling outside drowned out his words. Jack put on his jacket, pulled on his hat and gloves, and once again opened the door. The wind instantly hit him in the face, and the snow blinded his eyes, but he stood firm. The bear raised her head, her eyes meeting his gaze. For a moment, Jack froze. "If I make the wrong move, it's all over," he thought. He stepped toward the cub lying in the snowdrift. Its small body barely rose and fell. Life was slowly leaving it. Jack took another step carefully, as if walking on ice. The bear didn't move, but he noticed her nostrils twitch. When he was close enough to cover the second cub with a blanket, the bear tensed. Her powerful body rose above the snow, as if ready to pounce. "It's okay," Jack whispered, trying to keep his voice soft. "I'm just helping." He quickly covered the cub with the blanket, then stepped back, leaving enough space for her to retrieve her offspring herself. For a few seconds, she froze, her gaze piercing Jack. Then she carefully pulled the blanket, taking its edge with her teeth. Slowly, with great effort, she lifted the cub and headed back to the storage room. Jack held his breath until he saw her massive figure disappear behind the door. Inside the cabin, through the window into the storage room, Jack watched as the bear laid the second cub next to the first. She embraced them with her paws, shielding their bodies from the cold that still lingered in their frozen fur. Jack continued to watch, his thoughts torn between the instinct for survival and a sense of responsibility. "They're wild animals," he reminded himself. "Their place is not here. They could become a threat." But these arguments sounded weaker with each glance at the small bodies of the cubs, who were barely moving under her paws. Hours dragged on like eternity. Jack did everything he could to help from a distance. He brought more cans of hot water, placing them inside the storage room, while the bear watched his every move tensely. Then he brought a bowl of water and carefully left it by the door so she could drink when she felt safe. His body was exhausted from the cold and tension, but he couldn't allow himself to relax. At any moment, the situation could change. By morning, the cubs began to show signs of life. Jack noticed one of them move a paw, then lift its head. The other soon followed suit. The bear seemed to come alive with them. Her eyes gleamed with determination that Jack hadn't seen the day before. But now he faced a new challenge. How long can they stay here, he wondered, watching the little cubs tentatively exploring the storage room space. Jack knew this couldn't go on for long. The bears had to return to the forest. But at the same time, he realized that driving them out now would be sentencing them to death. This thought became his new prison. He knew that a moment would come when he would have to make a choice. But for now, he decided to give them a little more time. Time to warm up, regain strength. And once again, the bear's eyes met his through the glass. Her gratitude was silent, but it pierced him deeper than any words. Jack woke up with the first rays of the winter sun filtering through the frozen windows. His body ached from fatigue, and his consciousness wandered between reality and dreams, in which he saw the bear again. The memories were so real that he almost felt her presence. He got up, and the first thing he did was approach the window, separating his cabin from the storage room. The light from the lantern he had left on overnight still shone, illuminating the interior of the cramped space. The bear lay by the far wall, her massive body serving as a barrier between the cold air and the two little cubs. They slept, curled up, but now their breathing seemed even. Jack felt relief. At least they had survived the night. He looked at his watch. The storm was still raging, and according to the forecast, it would last another 2 days. This meant they would be neighbors longer than he had anticipated. The storage room gradually filled with warmth from the cans of hot water and a small portable heater that Jack had risked placing by the door. He knew this was dangerous. The bears could perceive it as a threat, but he couldn't leave them in the cold. The bear slowly opened her eyes when he placed another bowl of water near the door. Her gaze was attentive but not aggressive. She waited until he had fully retreated before cautiously leaning down to the bowl. He noticed how her enormous paws slightly trembled with exertion. "You'll make it," Jack muttered, standing at the doorway of his room. During the day, Jack watched the bears, trying not to disturb their peace. The cubs seemed to be coming around. At first, they uncertainly stood on their paws, taking a few shaky steps, then falling back. But within a few hours, they were already pushing each other, as if forgetting that they had recently been on the brink of death. The sight of this scene touched Jack more than he expected. His entire life had been dedicated to nature, observing it, studying it, documenting it. But he had never seen wildlife so close, so vulnerable. By nightfall, the wind intensified. The cabin shook like a ship in a storm, and the windows were covered with a thick layer of ice. Jack lit an old kerosene lamp, creating an island of light in the gloomy room. He ate in silence, listening to the storm shaking the walls. Every minute, his gaze returned to the window leading to the storage room. The bear seemed to be sleeping, her massive body barely moving. The cubs lay, huddled against her chest. "You did everything you could," Jack reminded himself. But inside, a troubling feeling grew that it wasn't enough. On the second day, Jack noticed that the bear was becoming more active. She raised her head every time he entered the room and watched him move. Her gaze was not like that of a typical wild animal. It held understanding and awareness of the situation. Meanwhile, the cubs began to play. At first, they uncertainly stood on their paws, taking a few steps, then falling back. But within a few hours, they were already pushing each other, seemingly forgetting that they had recently been on the brink of death. Jack couldn't help but smile. This small sign of life in the tiny storage room space seemed like a miracle. The storm did not abate. On the third night, Jack woke up to a loud crack. Another branch, covered in ice, had fallen somewhere in the yard. He automatically grabbed the flashlight and went to check the storage room. The bears were sleeping, but the bear raised her head when the flashlight's beam slid across her muzzle. She no longer looked at him as a threat. Her eyes were calm, almost relaxed. "You're doing great," Jack said softly. She didn't look away, and in her gaze, there was something he couldn't fully understand. Recognition. Understanding? Jack returned to his room and lay down, but sleep did not come. Thoughts swirled in his head. What would he do when the storm ended? He knew he couldn't leave the bears here. Their place was in the forest. But he also understood that they needed a little more time. The third morning brought the long-awaited sun. The clouds began to disperse, and the light reflecting off the snow filled the cabin with a soft glow. The world outside Jack's cabin windows looked as if it had frozen in time. The snow sparkled and every twig was covered with a thin layer of ice. The temperature had risen to -10, which in these parts was considered almost warm weather. Jack stood at the window and watched as the bear in the storage room slowly rose to her paws. Her movements were more confident than before. The cubs bounced around her, playing with each other, their energy and curiosity returning with each hour. Just a little longer, Jack thought, looking at them. One more day, and you can go. He knew he wasn't ready for that moment, but inside he felt they were ready. Their struggle for survival inspired him, reminding him that even in the harshest moments, life always finds a way to triumph. On the fourth morning, the storm finally subsided. The sunshine reflecting off the bare branches filled the snowy forest with a soft glow. The world outside Jack's cabin looked as if it had frozen in time. The snow sparkled, and every twig was covered with a thin layer of ice. The temperature had risen to -10, which in these parts was considered almost warm weather. Jack stood at the window and watched as the bear in the storage room rose to her paws. Her movements were more confident than before. The cubs bounced around her, playing with each other, their energy and curiosity returning with each hour. This scene warmed Jack's heart, but there was also something unbearably sad about it. He knew their time together was coming to an end. Jack stepped onto the porch, pulling on his winter jacket. The air was fresh but no longer biting as it had been in previous days. He surveyed the area. His cabin had survived the storm. Only a few branches had fallen on the roof, causing no serious damage. Approaching the storage room, he paused before opening the door. Inside, there was a soft rustling, The cubs were moving their paws, and the bear was watching them attentively. Jack took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "Shunom, all right," he said softly to himself. "Time to say goodbye." He opened the door carefully, trying not to make any loud noises. The warm air from the storage room mixed with the cold morning air. The sunlight filled the space, illuminating the bear and her cubs. She immediately raised her head, her alert gaze meeting his. She didn't move, but her body tensed, ready to protect her young if needed. "It's okay," Jack said, stepping back to give her space. The bear understood that the door was open. She slowly rose to her paws, gently nudging one of the cubs with her muzzle, then the other. Her movements were calm but purposeful. The cubs didn't immediately understand what was happening. They played a bit more in the storage room, sniffing the ground and walls before noticing the open passage. One of them approached the door, reached out with its muzzle to the fresh air, and, as if sensing the call of freedom, ran outside. The other followed, making clumsy jumps in the snow. The bear took her time. She looked back at Jack, their gazes meeting one last time. In her eyes there was a mix of alertness and something he couldn't quite grasp. Recognition? Gratitude? "You made it," Jack said softly, feeling a lump in his throat. She turned and walked away after the cubs. Her massive body moved with grace and confidence, returning her to the majesty that the cold and hunger had tried to take away. Jack stood at the door for a long time, watching as the family of bears disappeared into the forest. Their tracks on the snow were clear lines leading to the dense trees. The cubs jumped and played, while their mother followed behind, protecting them. When they almost vanished from sight, the bear stopped. She turned, standing at the edge of the forest, and looked back at him. It was a moment Jack would never forget. Their eyes met, and in that brief instant, he felt a connection that transcended all barriers between humans and wild nature. Then she turned and disappeared into the trees, her cubs following her, leaving only tracks in the snow as a reminder of those 3 days that changed their lives. Jack stood at the door for a long time. His thoughts wandered. He knew he had done the right thing, but that didn't make the goodbye any easier. These bears had left a mark not only on the snow but also in his heart. Returning to the cabin, he sat at the table and opened his old notebook. It was his habit to write down everything that happened in his life. He began to write, recalling every detail: the bear's gaze, the cub's trembling breath, the wind's howl, and his inner conflict. When he finished, the sun had risen higher, filling the room with light. He closed the notebook and leaned back in his chair. Sometimes rules need to be broken, he thought, especially if it saves lives. Over the next few days, Jack noticed how the bears' tracks on the snow gradually disappeared under the new snowfall. But their story stayed with him forever. Jack spent the night in silence, listening to the forest gradually coming back to life after the storm. The cracking of distant branches and the rare calls of birds reminded him that nature was returning to life, just like the bears he had released. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, but sleep did not come. His thoughts returned to the past days, like frames from a movie. The bear's eyes, her cautious movements, the cub's struggle for life, all of it was deeply imprinted in his memory. When the first rays of dawn broke into the room, Jack got up, brewed strong coffee, and dressed to go outside. The cold air greeted him with freshness, but it no longer felt hostile. The sun reflected off the sparkling snow, blinding but filling the world with light. Jack carefully inspected the yard. Where the snow had been trampled by the bear's paws the day before, now only faint outlines of tracks remain. These lines led into the forest, gradually disappearing among the trees. Jack followed these tracks, step by step, venturing deeper into the thicket. Here, everything was quiet, except for the distant cry of a raven. The tracks became less and less noticeable until they vanished completely. Jack stopped at the edge of the forest. It seemed to him that he could feel the presence of the bears, their life force once again in harmony with nature. Returning to the cabin, Jack sat at his table and opened the notebook where he recorded his observations of life in the wilderness. He began to write, trying to find the words to express what he had experienced. "This winter brought me a lesson I will never forget. It reminded me that life is not just about survival, but also about connection, between people and nature, between those who fight for life and those who can help. The bear and her cubs showed me that strength is not just the ability to endure, but also the capacity to trust, even when all seems lost. I broke the rules I had followed all my life, but I don't regret it. Perhaps I will never see this family again, but I will always remember them. Their eyes, their struggle, and their return to life. The tracks in the snow will disappear, but the tracks in my heart will remain forever. He paused to look at the words he had just written. The notebook was filled to the edges, the pages a jumble of notes reminding him of every step of his journey in solitude. In the following days, Jack continued to live as he was used to, but something inside him had changed. He often went out onto the porch and looked into the forest, trying to spot the dark silhouettes of the bears among the trees. Sometimes he found new tracks, but he wasn't sure if they belonged to that same family. His camera, which had been gathering dust on the shelf for the past few years, suddenly came back to life. He started taking pictures of the snow, the sun, the branches, the play of light on the ice. He wanted to capture every detail of this world he considered his home. One morning, as he was checking the fish traps by the frozen stream, he saw something that made him stop. On the other side of the stream, at the very edge of the forest, stood the bear. The sunlight gilded her fur, and beside her played the two cubs. Jack froze, not wanting to disturb the moment. The bear looked straight at him, their eyes meeting. She stood there for a few seconds as if confirming that everything was all right, and then turned and disappeared into the forest, her cubs following her. Jack remained standing by the stream, looking in the direction where they had vanished. He didn't reach for his camera, didn't take a picture. This moment was not for the world, it was just for him. When he returned to the cabin, the sun had risen high, and the snow began to sparkle like diamonds. Jack opened the door, breathed in the fresh air, and smiled. He felt he had made the right choice. Sometimes life presents us with lessons that cannot be explained in words. They remain within us, like a quiet whisper, like tracks in the snow. And although these tracks may disappear, their significance will never be forgotten.